Temporary deal reached. President Trump announces a plan to reopen the government for now. We're at the White House. Russia probe. One of President Trump's longtime associates is arrested in the special counsel's investigation into possible collusion with Moscow. World Youth Day. Pope Francis visits a juvenile detention center in Panama. We have a report from the global gathering. And saying hello. The Holy Father sends a greeting to a special someone following World Youth Day on TV. We'll tell you who it was. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, January 25th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. Federal employees affected by the 35-day shutdown will finally return to work. President Trump just announced support for a bipartisan 3-week deal to reopen the government. White House correspondent Mark Irons begins our team coverage. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Even though the agreement does not include additional border security funding, the president is not backing away from his demand for a wall. He's now giving lawmakers a new deadline to pay for it or else.
If we don't get a fair deal from Congress, the government will either shut down on February 15th again, or I will use the powers afforded to me under the laws and the Constitution of the United States to address this emergency.
If the president were to declare a national emergency at the border, that could provide military funds to potentially build the wall, but that declaration would likely be challenged in court. President Trump said a bipartisan committee of lawmakers will be formed to consider border spending before that February 15th deadline is reached. He says they are willing to put aside partisanship and put the security of American people first. Democratic leaders have long insisted they would not negotiate border security unless the president reopened the government, but they have not agreed to money for the wall. We'll see if the two sides can reach any sort of agreement over the course of the next 3 weeks. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. Congress is expected to act quickly, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says he hopes there will be good faith negotiations in the coming weeks. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has more of our team coverage. Jason?
Wyatt, today the shutdown caused major delays at some airports, and this is the second missed paycheck for furloughed federal workers. Now that there's a temporary deal in motion, the next challenge is hashing out a compromise on border security.
What the president's requesting for barrier funding based on DHS priorities is not unreasonable, and you have all, as Democrats, voted for more than this in the past. And this is the best chance we'll have to give legal status to over 1 million people to improve their lives. And the question is, do you hate Trump so much you won't do that?
Republican Lindsey Graham there saying Democrats need to agree to that deal, funding for a barrier in exchange for protecting dreamers. Those are the immigrants brought to the country illegally as kids. But Democrats today are still unconvinced on the wall.
We don't agree on some of the specifics of border security. Democrats are against the wall. But we agree on many things, such as the need for new technology and the need to strengthen security at our ports of entry. And that bodes well for coming to an eventual agreement.
The Senate chaplain opened up the Senate floor today, calling on God to help senators do what's right in this, quote, hour of national turmoil. And Congress has already passed a bill to grant back pay to federal workers missing their paychecks. Today, the president promised that money would come as soon as possible. This 35-day shutdown is now one for the record books. Wyatt?
The longest in U.S. history. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. A confidant of President Trump is under arrest tonight. Roger Stone is accused of witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and making false statements. He's the latest person to be swept up in the Mueller investigation of the 2016 presidential election. White House correspondent Mark Irons is back with more.
This has nothing to do with the president, has nothing to do with the White House.
That's the White House response after Roger Stone, one of the president's 2016 campaign associates, was arrested in an early morning FBI raid. CNN captured this video. The president later typed on Twitter, "Greatest witch hunt in the history of our country. No collusion, Border coyotes, drug dealers, and human traffickers are treated better. Who alerted CNN to be there? The indictment says a Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone about WikiLeaks and other info damaging to Hillary Clinton. Stone is accused of lying to Congress and obstructing the ongoing Russia investigation.
I will plead not guilty to these charges. I will defeat them in court. I believe this is a politically motivated investigation.
The 2016 hacked Clinton campaign emails did include conversations about Catholics. A News Nightly report found an email from a left-leaning scholar who wrote, "Many of the most powerful elements of the conservative movement are all Catholic, many converts," adding they, quote, "must be attracted to the systematic thought and severely backwards gender relations." In another email, a Hillary Clinton supporter urged the campaign to speak out aggressively against the Little Sisters of the Poor, writing, "Level a political nuclear blast ASAP against a Supreme Court decision that could come in June that would end the contraceptive mandate in Obamacare."
That was White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting from a little bit earlier. Roger Stone is now free on a $250,000 bond. His case will be moved to Washington, D.C. The Trump administration is forcing some migrants seeking asylum in the United States to wait in Mexico. It could be one of the most significant changes to the immigration system in years. The policy does not apply to children traveling alone, nor do asylum seekers from Mexico. The fallout continues at a Catholic high school in Kentucky after some of its students were involved in a viral video. Tonight's scheduled basketball game between Covington Catholic and Holmes High has been canceled. Officials from both schools agreed it would be best to postpone, with passions running high. An incident involving Covington Catholic students and a Native American man in Washington, D.C. sparked a national controversy. Pope Francis brings World Youth Day to a juvenile detention center in Panama. The Holy Father denounces how society puts up invisible walls to marginalize sinners and criminals. He celebrated an emotional mass inside the Catholic country's main facility for young inmates. The Pope also heard confessions in the prison, a papal first. Ursula Murua is Director of Digital Strategy and Social Media for EWTN News. She joins us from Panama City. Ursula, we often hear about Pope Francis visiting a prison or jail on one of his international trips. Why is it so important to him?
Well, he actually tries to be close to the people who are far from the Catholic Church or who feels that are far from God himself. So he's trying to be close to them. He always tries to include one of these visits in his trips when he goes overseas especially. And he has this special care for them. And actually today it was the first time ever that he hears confession in a prison. So he really wants us to understand how important it is to visit them, to be with them, and to provide them the opportunities to transform their lives, and to make them sure that they can change and that they are loved not only by God, but that they have a very important place in the Catholic Church.
All right, well, switching gears here a little bit, I want to ask you about Pilgrims from Nearby Venezuela, because they're taking part in World Youth Day. But what are they telling you about the political turmoil in their country?
Well, we have talked to several Venezuelans here. There are over 400 pilgrims from Venezuela, but most of them are already living in other countries. So most of them are coming from Colombia, Peru, even from Chile, but they feel that this is a very important moment for their country. They think that they still have a chance, to be delivered from this regime. They displayed last night a big flag before the Pope arrived to the welcoming ceremony. And we talked to them, and they didn't want to go on the record because they are afraid that their families or friends in Venezuela could be targeted if they speak against, if they speak out against the regime. But they are convinced that only prayer will save them. If you see the photo of that flag, you will see that they put the slogan, "Pray for Venezuela," very, very big. And, they are really convinced that the only way that they are going to be saved from this situation is through prayer. It's a miracle. They are waiting for a miracle indeed.
I'm sure a lot of people are going to be praying for them. World Youth Day typically is celebrated every 3 years. I understand there already are rumors on where the next one is going to be held. What are you hearing?
I do agree that next World Youth Day is going back to Europe. There are a lot of rumors going around here, but those rumors have base. The president of Portugal himself, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, is joining few Latin American presidents this weekend in the final mass. He's coming from Portugal to attend the final mass, and he already said to the press that he's waiting for Pope Francis himself to announce Lisbon as the next city hosting World Youth Day. It should be in the year 2022. So probably World Youth Day is going back to Europe, and it's going to be back also in the European summertime.
Okay, we'll continue to follow that and see if that turns out to be the place indeed. In the meantime, of course, stay with EWTN all weekend long as we wrap up World Youth Day. Ursula Murua, Director of Digital Strategy and Social Media for EWTN News, thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Some U.S. diplomats are leaving Venezuela amid the country's political crisis. The United States, Canada, and much of Latin America is backing opposition leader Juan Guaido over current President Nicolas Maduro, who has the backing of military generals. In a statement, the Vatican says Pope Francis is following the events closely and praying for an end to the suffering. Chaldean Catholics in Mosul, Iraq, have a new spiritual leader. Archbishop Najib Musa was inaugurated today by Cardinal Louis Sacco. Sacco is urging Christians to return to the city. The Islamic State took over Mosul in 2014, causing many Christians to flee. The United Arab Emirates says Pope Francis' visit next month is a way to build bridges. It is the first papal trip to the Arabian Peninsula. Islam is the official religion in the UAE. During his visit, the Holy Father will meet with Muslim clerics and other religious figures. In a landmark vote, lawmakers in Greece agreed to end a decades-long dispute over the name of neighboring Macedonia. The small country will be renamed North Macedonia, clearing the path for it to join NATO and the European Union. Riot police guarded Greece's parliament building after days of protests against normalizing of relations between the countries. Pope Francis will visit North Macedonia, formerly part of Yugoslavia, later this year. Coming up, a bishop from New York weighs in on the state's pro-abortion bill passed earlier this week. On this date 60 years ago, Pope John XXIII gave notice of his intention to convene Vatican II. The council focused on the Church's relationship to the modern world. It also implemented a number of reforms intended to make Catholic teaching more understandable. It began 3 years later. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. A bishop in New York State is calling out Governor Andrew Cuomo, a Catholic, for his support for a law making abortion legal up until birth. In an open letter to Cuomo published before the bill passed, Bishop Edward Scharfenberger of Albany wrote, "It is very difficult to understand how you can align yourself with Pope Francis and so vehemently advocate such a profoundly destructive legislation." And Bishop Scharfenberger joins me now via Skype from Albany. Your Excellency, welcome to the broadcast. You end your letter to Governor Cuomo with a plea: do not build this Death Star. What do you mean by that, and what's your reaction to the passage of this legislation?
Well, as you recognize the image from Star Wars, that the Death Star was being built by the enemies, I guess, of the resistance. But like a Trojan horse, nobody saw it as being something that was threatening or to be concerned about. And my concern about the legislation was the way it was being marketed as something that would actually help the health of women, help them in their pregnancies, help them in their decisions in life to take care of themselves and so forth, and actually was disguising what is a legislation that I think will be very, very destructive, not only obviously of human life in the womb, but of family life, of the life of women, because of its implications, what it really brings to. And so what I attempted to do in the letter was to expose, on the one hand, those who were promoting the bill, what they were saying, this was somehow about reproductive rights and helping women's health, when in fact it was actually very damaging to them.
And for all those reasons that you listed, many people are upset about this. Catholics, certainly, some Catholics are calling for Governor Cuomo to be excommunicated. First off, let's take a step back. What does that actually mean, and would that ever be likely to happen?
Well, excommunication is a very, as you know, a very extreme thing to do. And one has to think before one does it. first of all, what would be its purpose. Now, the reasons that the church has historically at times used excommunications is in cases where there seems to be no other recourse to get to the heart and soul of the person who is in very serious sin, to note that very publicly and to bring them back to the practice of the faith. So what we try to do is everything possible in order to point out the discrepancy, in this case with Governor Cuomo, between what he's doing and what he says he's doing, hopefully to go about a change of heart. As you know, there are other measures that one can take before taking that drastic step.
Okay, so noting that, what do you think is the next step for the pro-life movement in New York?
Well, the pro-life movement has been growing tremendously. As a matter of fact, it wasn't until this legislative session that this particular question was faced. Up to the last 12 years, even though the legislation was originally proposed by Governor Spitzer in 2007, the New York State pro-life movement, the Catholic Conference, was able to see that it did not get passed. Of course, we had a legislative turn, and now those that voted the bill in. I always say to people, elections have consequences. Think about what the position of a candidate is before you pull that lever. So I think most of our effort is going to have to be in reminding people of the importance of those electoral choices. You have a tremendous power in the ballot box. The other thing that we need to do also is to continue our efforts to support women who are in these very difficult situations. Most of the time when an abortion is even being considered, it's because the person, a family, a woman, an individual woman, just see no alternative at that point. So as Pope Francis always reminds us, we have to be there to support and to walk with all of those who are experiencing difficult situations in those vulnerable states.
Such an important message, and one that I think so many New Yorkers will get behind, and of course pro-lifers across the world. Bishop Edward Scharfenberger of the Diocese of Albany, thanks so much for talking with us.
Thank you very much, Floyd.
Up next, the Education Secretary for the U.S. Bishops tells us how Catholic schools can survive and thrive. And Pope Francis has some words for his predecessor at World Youth Day. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The Mormon Church says it does not oppose hate crime legislation in Utah, even if it includes protection for homosexuals and those who consider themselves transgender. A church official says Mormons have been victims of hate crimes over the years and believe no group should be targeted based on membership. Sunday marks the beginning of Catholic Schools Week, spotlighting the value of Catholic education in the United States. According to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, 99% of Catholic school students graduate from high school, and 86% of Catholic school graduates attend college. Join me now is Mary Pat Donoghue, Executive Director of the Secretariat of Catholic Education for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Mary Pat, welcome back. You and I met years ago when you were the principal at St. Jerome Academy in Hyattsville, Maryland. You've seen Catholic education from all sides. Teacher, administrator, now in this position as Secretariat. What are some of the unique benefits of a Catholic school education?
Catholic school education forms children in an integral manner, bringing in their faith, their intellectual development, their moral, their social development, really in order for them to be the people that God has created them to be. And then in turn to bring that formation and those skills into a world that's badly in need of that type of formative whole person approach.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, because there are so many challenges to Catholic schools nowadays. What do you think are some of the greatest challenges facing Catholic schools, and what do you think we can do to help?
Certainly Catholic schools face challenges along the lines of financial revenue. Right now it's a largely tuition-based model, which oftentimes means it's a burden for families who are already struggling to make ends meet. So I think it's important for the entire church to recognize the value that Catholic education brings to the church's evangelical mission, and that all of us really do bear a responsibility for that. So I think helping schools find diverse funding streams to enable them to continue their missions would be one challenge. We're always challenged too to effectively provide for diverse students, diverse learning needs, for example, students with special education needs, students who are newcomers to the United States, students who speak languages other than English. So all of that too requires resources and training. So,
what do you think we can do as Catholics to promote Catholic school education to bring more young people into the church?
I think that's a very good question. And I do think that keeping young people in the church is a matter certainly of training them in the ways of the faith, but also incorporating an intellectual foundation. It's important that children understand the why from the time that they're very small, and that they begin to understand things like the nature of the human person from the time they're small all the way through. And in that way, if we feed the intellectual side and we continue to encourage them to question and provide them with truth and full answers, then I think we have a better chance of keeping them in the church as young adults.
Such an important message. I think that's where people lose out. They don't realize that theology, the philosophy, all need to come together with just math and science.
Completely. And from the time that they're small. You know, there's a growing number of curricular programs that address this. We don't want to wait until they're past the age of questioning to begin to provide some of these answers. We want to begin doing that in an integral way. So certainly a Catholic education would emphasize the importance of math and science, but we would see those subjects as gateways to the wonder of creation, to stimulate in students a sense of awe and a sense of wonder. And the ancient Greeks knew that wisdom began in wonder. And that's something I think we're all called to bring back to our kids today.
An important message, and obviously Catholic education has benefited so many people over the years and decades. Mary Pat Donoghue, Executive Director for the Secretariat of Catholic Education for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Thanks so much for talking with us about it.
Thanks so much for having me, Wyatt.
And finally tonight, in his remarks at World Youth Day's opening ceremony, Pope Francis quotes his predecessor, Benedict XVI. He then goes one step further.
El Papa Benedicto XVI, que está mirando y lo vamos a aplaudir. Le mandamos un saludo desde acá.
The Holy Father asking the crowd to say hello to Benedict. He said he would be watching on television. Such a great way to say hello to Pope Benedict, and a good note to wrap up our newscast for tonight and for this week. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.